there have always been forest fires. Yet, over the last 100 years, the danger of fire to human beings and its impact on the land has increased. Homes built in or around forests are at risk as fires rage near urban areas, threatening lives and property.
Around the turn of the century, in the 1900s, there were a number of catastrophic fires in Montana, in the Midwest, which burned millions of acres. These often were set at inappropriate times to burn slash. They got out of hand. They killed people. They demolished buildings. And there was an outcry in the United States, not just California, that fire was bad. Fire had to be put out.
As a result, for nearly 100 years, fire suppression has been federal policy for the millions of acres of public land here in the United States.
The chief job of all the men who compose the firefighting forces is to spot the fires at the earliest possible moment, to reach the fire promptly, check its spread.
But after so many years of putting out all fires, growth unchecked by fire has left forests overcrowded.
So during times such as drought, there's a lot of competition for moisture. Trees are more stressed, they're more susceptible to insects, particularly bark beetles, and diseases.
For some forests, this mix of stress, insect infestation, and disease can be a killer combination. Add the problem of dead and dying trees to the years of accumulated forest fuels, and it's easy to see how a small blaze can quickly become an unstoppable crown fire.
We have a lot more vegetation and a lot more fuels on the ground than we've ever had before. This causes high-intensity fires. The smaller trees catch fire and it just goes on up the vegetation ladder until it tops out and it totally destroys everything that's burning.
Only you can prevent forest fires.
Actually, no one can prevent forest fires. They occur naturally. Many forests evolved with fire, and recurrent burns help plants and wildlife thrive. In the millions of acres of wildlands, far from any urban interface, can fire play a role in restoring forest health?
I'm honored to be here to sign the Healthy Forest Restoration Act of 2003.
With the constant threat of uncontrollable fires in overcrowded forests, the federal government is attempting to nurse America's forests back to health by removing the dangerous buildup of fuels. But exactly how to do this is controversial, since the concept of forest health has changed over the years.
While fire is the worst enemy of trees, disease and old age also take their devastating toll.
In contrast, foresters today think differently, seeing health not in terms of individual trees, but with regard to the forest as a whole and its resilience to natural disturbances like fire and pests.
So it's important that we move back to a forest that can withstand disturbances, that can withstand stress from droughts or a changing climate, or from wildfire, which is surely going to enter the system.
What we do know about forest systems is, given the plant community, the vegetation type, and the processes that are going on within them, they would have had a range of conditions, a historical range of variability. And it's clear that the forest currently is outside of those kind of conditions.
Efforts have been made to restore forests to historical conditions through the use of fire as well as the cutting of trees. But there was little scientific information about how the effects of thinning might differ from the effects of fire.
We've known for quite a while we can make the forest look like what it would have looked like historically from a fire burning through the stand. But if we mimic that appearance, what does that actually do to the functional processes of the forest?
If that question was to be answered, it would take time and a dedicated scientific team to discover the precise roles that fire and thinning play in restoring forest health.
See how much they've grown in just 2 or 3 years. And
that research took place in the Teakettle Forest. This is the Sierra Nevada, just east of Fresno, California. Here, researchers have been working for almost 10 years on a Forest Service experiment to study the impact of fire and thinning on the ecosystem.
Way back in the beginning of the Forest Service, there was a need and a recognition that, in fact, if we were going to do management that was relevant and that was based on the best science, we had to have a research arm.
It's very difficult to understand how an ecosystem operates in total. The only way that it really can be done from a practical standpoint is to bring as many scientists and practitioners together in one area and work on different parts of the ecosystem, study, do research.
Here at Teakettle, Malcolm North and a team of researchers began their multi-year study.
Hey. Hi. How you guys doing? Hi, Malcolm. Yeah, good to see you. How's it going up there? Yeah, good to see you.
The main emphasis of the Teakettle experiment was to really look at how we might develop measurements of the functions within a mixed conifer system and be able to assess how fire and thinning did at restoring those functions. Well, yesterday when we were out in the plots, I noticed that we had some trees that were untagged over here in US 1, so let's see if we can go in there and find out.
This mixed conifer forest, like many in the western U.S., used to burn about every 15 years, but it has now gone over 130 years without a large fire.
One of the first things we had to do in setting up the experiment was determine the correct size for the plots and also where to locate them.
Researchers found that mixed conifer is made up of 3 distinct patch types: closed canopy areas, open gaps, and shrub communities in the understory.
It turned out that we needed a plot which was at least 10 acres in size, or 4 hectares, to be able to be large enough to include those patches, and also so that we could take 18 of these plots and put them within the forest and have an equal proportion or representation of those patch conditions amongst those 18 different plots. What struck me immediately about the place is it's just a beautiful old-growth forest.
An old-growth forest is ideal for research because its unmanaged condition reflects ecosystem processes that have shaped the forest over time. In addition, old growth provides the basis for a strong experimental design.
We were really interested in making sure that the plots were replicate or very similar to each other in initial conditions. That's very important because when we're going to apply treatments to them, we need to be able to detect whether the difference is due to the treatment or, in a worst case, it might be due to some initial condition, initial differences between the plots to begin with.
Treatments in the Teakettle forest would involve the application of fire or thinning, or both, to various plots in the forest. Before the treatments were applied to these plots, scientists needed to investigate how the forest functioned.
And we had no way of being able to understand the range of background variability without spending 2 and in some cases up to 3 years measuring responses before any treatments were applied.
To collect data at common sample points, researchers developed a grid point system.
And we forced everyone to sample at these particular points. There are 402 of them spread between the 18 plots, and they're all on a regular grid system. But with that method, we could take someone's soil nutrient information and compare it to the soil moisture information, the rates of decomposition, and the rates of soil respiration to bring together diverse studies. So let's see what we've got in the way of biomass, and I'll read out some numbers for you here.
Okay.
Once the data was collected and analyzed, researchers had an invaluable set of baseline measurements of conditions in the forest.
One of the first things we wanted to know is what would be the key drivers within a mixed conifer ecosystem. The usual suspects would be something like water, nutrients, amount of sunlight.
We're good? All right.
A lot of the context for this experiment, looking at processes and what happened in the forest, are similar to many other places in which fire was an important part of the ecosystem.
To understand how fire would affect this forest, researchers focused on how the forest's physical structure affected the food supply for animals.
Still nothing?
They also considered the role of slash and litter in the cycling of nutrients. and the importance of soil moisture.
The environment here in the Sierras and the mixed conifer forest is a fairly stressful environment for trees, and especially when you have a high density of trees and you combine that with a dry year, there's basically too many trees looking for the soil moisture.
Competition for moisture stresses trees and leaves them vulnerable to pests and disease.
In the last few decades in the Sierra, we've seen insect outbreaks, both bark beetles and spruce budworm and other insect defoliators having a fairly large impact on the forest and killing a lot of trees, especially during drought years.
In the past, fire was the main mortality agent of smaller trees. Now, pests and disease have replaced fire, and they kill both small and large trees, often in groups. Researchers also found that old-growth forests like Teakettle are losing more large trees to pests and disease than had been the case when they were exposed to recurrent fire.
When we first started looking at aerial photographs, the canopy in the Teakettle forest was very dense. And what we think is, over the last 60 years or more, where we've had fire suppression and the density of the forest has increased compared to what it would have been in the 1880s, this is now putting much more competitive stress on even the largest trees.
In their study of forest processes, scientists considered whether precipitation determines where and when plants and trees become established.
The Teakettle forest, in fact most mixed conifer forests, are very dry. All of the precipitation occurs in the winter as a snowpack. And once the snow is gone, there's a very brief window of soil moisture.
The longer that you can keep moisture levels up in the summer, the longer you're going to have growth and productivity.
We had found with a seedling experiment that one of the most difficult things for the seedlings was competition between the trees and the shrubs. How did the trees ever then outdistance the shrubs? How did they ever manage to become established to be able to grow past the shrub competition?
Researchers found that many trees became established during wet El Niño periods, years when water was abundant. But once established, the trees grew faster than scientists expected.
I was shocked at how quickly these trees grow in a system where most of the precipitation comes in the form of snow. Where are these trees getting the moisture they need to put on that kind of growth on an annual basis?
We ended up comparing notes from a number of different studies. It turns out that almost all the overstory trees in this forest are getting their water down deep, very deep in this system, possibly down in cracks in the bedrock.
And what it seems is happening is that the trees are able to throw out a root structure that goes deep enough where they can tap into these pockets in the granite of water, so they have water access year-round.
And if a tree can survive long enough to get its roots down deep, it can lock into this more extensive and very steady source of water. And once it's locked into that, given the abundant sunshine we have here in the summer, the trees can grow very, very fast.
So soil moisture is the most important driving force in organizing these forests.
The forest canopy itself, by gathering the sunlight, is creating most of the energy within the system, providing carbohydrates, which not only fuel the growth of the tree, but are available to a number of underground processes as well. There's a network of fungi in the ground, mycorrhizae, which actually often connects a lot of the trees. It connects different species of trees and connects even between the trees and the shrubs.
So the symbiotic relationship begins up in the forest canopy and extends all the way out through the soil.
And these mycorrhizal fungi also produce fruiting bodies, and these fruiting bodies are oftentimes underground, and they're called truffles. And these truffles, in turn, turn out to be a major food source, in fact, the primary food source for a small mammal, such as the flying squirrel. See this beautiful tail? It gives it extra lift during its glide. Here's the gliding membrane, the patagium that goes from the forearm to the rear leg. Flying squirrels also have very soft and thick fur. It gives them great insulation and for staying warm in the winter. Northern flying squirrel, along with a number of other small mammals, is a primary disperser of spores of truffles. The spores pass through the digestive tract of these small mammals without being destroyed or digested, and then there can often be deposited 10, 20, 100, 200 meters or more away from where the fruiting body originally was found.
The flying squirrel is a good example of the importance of ecosystem connections in the forest. When flying squirrels scatter truffle spores, they do more than produce more truffles for small mammals to eat. They are spreading fungi that grow in the soil and attach to tree roots. Trees require these mycorrhizal fungi to gather all the nutrients and water they need. In turn, the fungi get energy from photosynthesis, occurring in the canopy overhead. In this canopy, large trees provide cavities for flying squirrel nests. Large trees also provide important habitat for the spotted owl, a top predator that preys on flying squirrels.
So there's a whole web of connectivity that's very dependent on the structure and changes in the structure of the forest, and it changes as that structure is affected by fire and thinning.
To investigate those changes and consider how they affect this web of connectivity,
Okay, got it, Andy.
researchers from widely different fields worked together during the Teakettle experiment.
Right now I've been looking at the interannual variation in soil respiration, and I'm finding that there's
Oftentimes after a day in the field, we'll have a campfire and sit around and discuss what we're finding in our research.
I'd like to get that reference.
It was a hardwood and a conifer. You never would have expected it. But
There's quite a few common trends where all of our research is intertwined in some way, shape, or form, given that it's a natural system and everything is interacting.
in forests and regeneration, often the bottleneck is trying to get established and be able to get going.
To develop a root system that will tap into a sufficient water source to...
One of the fascinating things to me from being involved in this collaborative study was having so many different studies working in one place and finding out how these forests have developed over time.
You know, in my forestry education, you always thought about trees competing in terms of crown dynamics, and things are playing out in the forest that you can see, which is over your head, and the competition for light. But if you're in a real moisture-driven system, maybe a lot of what's going on is below the ground that we're just not seeing.
And that's what's extremely valuable about the Teakettle experiment. It involved animal ecologists, insect ecologists, microclimatologists, fire ecologists, botanists. So the team to investigate it was just about as complicated as the forest itself.
It's great for being able to look at actually where things end up and they go in the system. So.
After scientists completed their baseline research on the forest ecosystem, burning and thinning treatments were systematically applied to 18 experimental plots. Plots were either burned or not. In thinning treatments, larger canopy trees were cut on some plots, while smaller understory trees were cut on others. On some plots, both thinning and burning occurred. Control plots were left unchanged. For more than 5 years since the treatments were applied, research at Teakettle has continued, with the goal of identifying the effects of fire and thinning on forest health.
Most of the functions we were looking at, everything from decomposition to respiration to understory plant diversity, all of those responded very positively to the burn. In fact, most of those processes were kind of stalled without having the fire go through the system. So that the fire does a lot to be able to not only clear out the fuels in the stand, but to also jumpstart and restart a lot of the functions and processes that we were following.
Scientists also found that burning significantly reduced the number of shrubs, which helped tree seedlings get established.
The fire treatments can help aid the tree establishment, especially in the initial years, by knocking back the density of shrubs and reducing their hold on the soil resource, the soil moisture, and giving the trees a chance to become established over time.
When researchers applied burn treatments to their plots, they faced restrictions as to when prescribed fires could be lit.
We have constraints from the air regulators on when we can burn, and that's based on air quality. If we're burning during fire season, we're using fire crews, and fire managers have a concern that we're using fire crews that should be on standby fighting forest fires.
So in the case here, we could not actually burn the forest until we got the first fall rains, and that occurred towards the end of October. And because of that, with the lower temperatures and the higher humidity, the fire doesn't carry as well. The additional fuel created by the thinning operation substantially increases the work that the fire does.
It releases a lot of the nitrogen and other nutrients, presumably, that are tied up in organic material, makes those nutrients more available for plants.
As for thinning, researchers found that cutting small understory trees reduced moisture stress for the remaining trees, making them less vulnerable to pests and disease. Understory thinning also removed ladder fuel trees, which allow flames to climb up into the overstory canopy and kill large, older trees. Without ladder fuels, flames consume only understory and surface biomass during a fire. However, the removal of the understory without the use of fire failed to restore the functions of the ecosystem.
Certainly a concern for a lot of scientists would be that you could restore the appearance of the structure with a thinning, but that you are putting a lot of fuels back into the system, and that ends up actually contributing to part of the problem that you already have. There ends up being more fuel on the ground again.
And litter is often a very effective barrier to seedlings getting established because it dries out very quickly and gets very hot. So for a very small seedling, it's very hard to get established.
In contrast to the effects of understory thinning, cutting large overstory trees disrupted important linkages in the ecosystem.
If you think of the canopy within a forest as generating much of the energy, providing a lot of the carbohydrates that fuel various processes in the forest, once you substantially remove a lot of that from the site, a lot of things are affected within the forest and basically change the functioning of the ecosystem.
If too much of the canopy is removed, too many nest trees are removed. This could impact where flying squirrels occur. Without that cover, this could expose them more to predators, such as owls and other raptors. It could also reduce the food of flying squirrels because without those trees, you have fewer roots. And what this impacts is truffle abundance.
And certainly it implies to all the scientists who worked on this project that when you're looking at what size of tree to remove from a plot, it should be weighed very carefully as to whether you'd remove a tree that's large enough for its overstory crown to be in the canopy.
After years of research at Teakettle, scientists suggest that moderate thinning and the frequent use of fire are the best ways to keep intricate forest ecosystems healthy.
The natural role of fire seems to be one of rejuvenation. It recycles things, it recycles nutrients, and it turns it into ash, and the ash is able to be carried into the soil by rainwater. And it's taken many years of research before we feel now comfortable that we do understand what the role of fire is and how often fire has occurred in the past. How often do we have to burn now by prescription in order to imitate the previous conditions?
We should take every opportunity we can. We should open up that burn window as much as possible to allow us to reintroduce fire into the ecosystem.
If we don't continue to burn these forests, we're going to have an increased likelihood of this wildfire occurring, and then the particulate matter that's put up in the atmosphere is just massive.
We need to move forward with some urgency. We need to begin to use what we've learned here at Teakettle to break the cycle of damaging wildfires and damaging insect mortality.
Restoring forests after a century of fire suppression will take time and further research. But the Teakettle experiment suggests that thinning alone is not enough.
The thinning really needs to be a tool to be able to serve the processes of the fire, rather than focusing so much on thinning as the first priority and questioning how large of trees we can remove. The focus should be much more on trying to get fire back into the system and using the thinning to be able to increase the work that the fire does within the forest.
In the past, forest management or silviculture often focused on how best to grow trees quickly.
For it must be remembered that timber is a crop, and trees ripen and cease to grow, just the same as any other crop.
But now, the research at Teakettle suggests it is time for a new management approach that focuses on fire.
Prescribed fire, the use of fire in the forest, and thinning go hand in hand. And the use of one, the thinning, can often set up the scenario that makes it appropriate to use prescribed fire in the forest.
The story of Teakettle would be, hey, we're here struggling in a polarized policy and management climate, and we're answering the basic question of how these things evolve. It's going to inform policymakers and rule makers across the spectrum, and we've got some hard choices to make.
Research in other areas of the United States confirms the value of fire in restoring forests that evolved with frequent low-intensity burns.
Is everybody set? It sounds like we got a couple of people going up above and the rest of us will head down below.
The Teakettle Experiment contributes to this new understanding that fire plays a vital role in restoring forest health.